Good afternoon or morning, depending upon your time zone. We're here on the East Coast. Thank you for joining our webinar, React and How It Relates to Modern Web Development. My name is Annette Brady. I'm serving the minor role of your host today, but I have the great pleasure to extend a warm welcome to our resident expert, Chris Minnick. Chris is a prolific published technical author and a pioneer of the early internet. He has been teaching for 18 years and has taught React for 4 years. Chris has authored and co-authored over a dozen books, including titles in the For Dummies series and several books for teaching kids to code. Today, he is looking forward to sharing with us some of the passion he holds for React. Before we get started, though, we want to let you know that if you have any questions, please type them in the question box on the side of your screen. We will take a pause at 12:15 to answer some of them, and we have allotted 30 minutes for this webinar, so if there are additional questions and you'd like to stick around afterward, we will be happy to answer as many as possible. On that note, the floor is yours, Chris.
Great, thanks, Annette. Hi, everyone, and welcome to this webinar. I'm going to be talking a little bit about React and just giving a brief overview of what React is, and I'm going to hopefully explain the key concepts and ideas behind React and tell you where React can be useful as well. So React is a library for building user interfaces. This is the most basic definition of what React is, but actually React is much more because of the ecosystem around the library, as you'll see. I want to talk about how to write React, but first I'm going to just tell you some facts about React and introduce you to some of the concepts that you need to understand in order to be able to program successfully with React. React was created by Facebook, and then in reaction to concerns that their previous license could lead to patent litigations, they open sourced it under the MIT license. Today it's the most popular JavaScript UI library. What React does is it makes composable web components. So using React, you can make reusable pieces of your user interface, and then React renders these and updates them based on changes to the state of the application. React views can work anywhere. It's most common that your React user interface renders in a web browser, but it can be rendered anywhere that components are useful. So it does this by having the core React library, which handles the actual rendering of components and communication between components, and then it has a separate package which handles the actual rendering and update of the user interface. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a moment. But React works with other frameworks well because it basically is just the user interface. And React doesn't require you to completely buy into it. So you can just start using some React in your web application and maybe use it along with other libraries such as Angular, or you might use it with ASP.NET, or you could use it in conjunction with Node, Express, and Mongo, or Meteor and React. You don't need to convert to React in whole. You can just start using it for pieces of your application. React is, as I mentioned, it's a user interface library. It's not a framework. By itself, built in, React doesn't have AJAX capabilities, and it doesn't have a data layer. So this is what makes it different from something like even jQuery, but certainly it's a smaller library than Angular is. However, there are components in React and parts of the React ecosystem that do all of these things, and it's very common to combine React with small agent libraries like Axios, or to combine it with a data store system such as Redux. You can use React to build complex single-page applications. You can use it as a substitute for views in a traditional MVC. You can use it to generate static HTML on the server. You can also use it to create native mobile apps using React Native. React is very popular and widely used. Here's just some of the companies that use it. I've taught React at some of these companies, and it's used by many more places as well. So I want to get into a little bit of coding and just show you what it looks like to get started with a React application. And the most common way today is to use a program called Create React App. Create React App just creates a boilerplate React application It's a really useful tool just for getting started with sort of a standard setup and also for learning about React. And so if you have a new version of Node installed, you can follow along or follow along later. But we're going to use the command npx, which is going to download all the packages you need for this. And then we're going to use create React app and then the name of the project you want to create. And this is going to go through and do a whole lot of downloading of packages, installing packages. Generally will take a couple minutes. And so while this is running, I'm going to talk a little bit more about create React app, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about React components in general. So create React app is a program that creates a React app with no configuration. And if you were doing React development maybe 2 years ago, you know that this is a big deal. There are a lot of pieces to creating a React application, things like Webpack, Babel, your Webpack dev server, the testing frameworks, and your linting program that you need to put together and put together in the right way to be able to compile, run, and test React applications. Create React app does all of that boilerplate for you. So it definitely simplifies the setup for your single page applications and for learning. However, it does sacrifice some flexibility. If you want some sort of very custom setup, you probably will need to customize your Create React app setup, or you can just bypass using Create React app. Most people, though, today that I see are using Create React app just to get started with projects. That said, I don't consider it a good substitute for actually understanding the tools that are needed for doing React development, but it is really great when you want to just write React code quickly. And here's what it does. It installs a lot of local packages, so React, React DOM, development server, Webpack, Babel, and so on, and then creates a boilerplate project. If you do need to configure something with Create React app, you can eject. You can use npm run eject inside your project, and that's going to unbundle everything, make it so that you can customize all the configuration files. You can customize, swap out different tools that you're using. So if my timing is good, yep, we should be right here. So the editor I'm using here is WebStorm from JetBrains, and it has this great integrated terminal that you can access down here. Other good editors include Atom or Microsoft Visual Studio Code or Brackets from Adobe. I like WebStorm. That's what I've been using for a long time, but I'm also using Visual Studio Code quite a bit right now, and it seems like the industry in general is moving towards Visual Studio Code. That has the benefit of being completely free, whereas WebStorm's not. So I've created my React app, and I'm going to change into the directory and then do npm start. And this is going to start up a development server and launch a web browser. And then in just a second, we'll see the demo application. And this has just an animated logo here and a link. It's a very, very, very simple interface. But if we go back to the code, you can see the generated code and kind of walk through that. And I can explain the structure of a React application and how React components work. And as I do this, I'm going to do a split screen thing here so you can see the actual application and you can see changes being made to it as I work here. So in a React application, you have an index.js file, and this is the root of your project. This is what actually gets included as the main thing in your application where everything starts. All the processing starts here. And this is the uncompiled, uncompressed code when this actually gets sent to a web server. Before it gets sent to a web server, all of this will be bundled up into a single JavaScript file with a lot of child files and all the dependencies included. So we start by importing the React library itself and importing the React DOM library, which does the rendering to the web browser. We import our CSS, and then we import app. This service worker, I generally disable this or remove it in a development environment because this handles the caching and the browser cache, which can cause problems in a development environment. I think that problem's generally been fixed. With newer versions of Create React App, but I believe in just disabling it anyway, just to be sure. And so that done, we then have this React DOM.render statement. And this is the only place in the entire application where we're interfacing with the web browser. So React DOM.render is rendering this app element. And this is basically a custom web element that we're then rendering into the element with an ID of root. So we're looking inside of the document, doing getElementById method to find an element with the ID of root. And so where that is in our HTML file right here. So this is our HTML file, and then we have a div with an ID of root here. And then everything below this is just rendering of components and then subcomponents. So if we look at what an actual React element looks like, here is app, and this is called our root, our main component. So we're importing React and the component class from the React library. We're importing a graphic and then some CSS. React uses the new style ES6 classes. So here we're creating a class that extends the React.component, and then every component contains a render method. It's the one crucial and required method inside of a React component. And the render method just returns some piece of the user interface. And then this is where things kind of get interesting, because if you look at this, it may look like something that as web developers we're told we should definitely never do, which is to combine our HTML with our JavaScript. So this looks an awful lot like HTML. So what's going on here? I see that it is 9:15 just about, and so if we have any questions, I'll answer those before I go on and talk about what actually is going on here. So Annette, do we have any questions?
Yes, actually we do. Thank you for that. So the first one we have here is, how does React compare to Angular and Vue.js?
Great. Yeah, React is definitely more pure JavaScript than either of those. Angular is a heavier library. It has a lot more built-in functionality than React, and it also has a much steeper learning curve. Vue, on the other hand, is somewhere in between the two. I would say Vue takes a lot of the best features of Angular and the best features of React and creates a library that allows you to do much of what you would do with React or Angular. So in terms of comparison, React is probably the most pure of the three. So if you know JavaScript, if you're familiar with how JavaScript in the web works, then actually learning React is fairly simple. The other two maybe have a bit more custom functionality that you need to understand.
So this next question is a great follow-up to that. What would you say are the most important prerequisites for learning React?
I would definitely say a good understanding of JavaScript, but in particular, you'll want to know how modern JavaScript works. So everything from JS, we call it ES for ECMAScript, which is the standardized version of JavaScript, from ES6, which is also known as ES 2015, going forward. There was, in 2015, a major overhaul of JavaScript was done, which introduced things like classes and a lot of the syntax you see here, this import statement, the classes, and what I'm going to talk about with this. And React makes use of these new syntaxes and new features extensively. So definitely you'll want to understand JavaScript and then have some knowledge of HTML and CSS as well.
So Chris, I don't know how much more presentation you have, and I want to be mindful of our cutoff for most folks at 12:30. So I didn't know if you wanted to proceed, and we'll save the others for the end. Up to you.
Yeah, I'd like to just cover what's going on here in the return statement of a component. And then definitely if we have more questions, we'll get into more questions. So we have our component here, and it has a render method with a return statement inside of it. And in here we have something that looks like HTML. This is actually not HTML. this is called JSX. It's a JavaScript extension, or a XML extension to JavaScript. Everything in here actually gets compiled into JavaScript prior to this code running in the browser. So although it looks like we're writing HTML, we're actually writing JavaScript, but just doing it using a simplified template language. And you can see how this works by going to Babel. Babel is what's called a JavaScript transpiler. It takes new style JavaScript code and translates it into browser compatible older JavaScript code. And you can try that out here and see how it takes JSX code and compiles it into JavaScript. So I'm going to just write some JSX. And then you'll see on the right that it gets translated into React.createElement methods. We're creating a header element with this content. And you can put sub-elements in there. So if I wanted to put in something like a span right here, or render some kind of a custom component, those things will get converted into nested React.createElement statements. So what you're actually deploying in a React application are these methods, the React.createElement statements, describing the JSX code here. But it's much easier to write JSX than it is to write React.createElement statements. And so now, using this development environment and your components inside of your hot reloading application, you can then just make changes inside of the JSX and then see them reflected instantly inside the web browser. And we can create additional components, subcomponents, and render anything you want in here. The one rule being that everything has to roll up into a single element. So notice we have a div that starts and ends this. Any single element with as many nested elements inside of it can be rolled up into a React component. Where you get errors is if you try to render more than one element without a parent. Like that, we'll get an error that says adjacent JSX elements must be wrapped. And so those are the main points about React. I'm going to just go through a couple more slides here. React components have to have a root component, and that root component has subcomponents. All React components are instances of the React.component class, as you saw, and they're composed using JSX. And here's the basic structure, as you saw, where you have a class that extends React.component and has a render method with a return statement. When you're building, a best practice when you're building React components is to remember the rule of first. And this says that React components should be focused, independent, reusable, small, and testable. In general, you should stick to the practice of the concept of single responsibility. So a component should do only one thing. If you get to a point where you find a component is too large to actually be considered a single component that only does one thing, you can decompose it. You can make nested components, you can make additional components. And think about your components as having a single reason to change. So a button is a good idea, a good example of a component. A search box would be a good component. An output row or something like that. These are components that can be composed and reused throughout your application. Components can talk to each other using props, and these are written using just HTML attributes that are passed from parent to child. And components can have state, which think this is where I'll stop, because state is a key concept in React, and it deals with the idea of why does your application change. And so an example of a stateful user interface component would be a button or a text field or data that comes in from an external source. These are reasons for your user interface to change, and generally are kept in an object called the React state. In React, this state is what determines whether the user interface will re-render. And so in this application, we don't have any state. We're simply just rendering static markup. There's nothing changing here. If we had dynamic data coming into here, or if we had an input, we could create some reason for the interface to change. And so this input becomes a stateful component which can update the actual user interface. But until you have something stateful, you're just rendering static HTML. And so with about 5 minutes left here, Annette, I'll turn it back over to you for any more questions we have.
Thank you very much, Chris. I appreciated that presentation. I do have a final question here, because we do have some housekeeping things to do before we sign off. What is the most difficult thing to learn about React?
I would say the most difficult thing to learn about React is that something that we didn't actually touch on here, and that's the idea of one-way data flow. And I think I have a little bit later in my presentation here, I have, there's a graphic. In React, all the data flows from parent down to child, and then from child down to subchild. So all of your data flows from parent to child. There are times, though, when you need to update data in a parent component from a child. And this is generally how functionality works, where you'll have a button that's part of a form, and you want to click that button in order to update text that may be at the same level in this hierarchy as the form. And in React, we only have one-way data binding. So changes to a form field don't automatically affect the user interface. Instead, we have to have higher level components react to events that happen on lower level components. And that's how we update data. It's not intuitive at first, and this is a difficult concept to learn, but once you do, the benefits are cleaner structure in your application and much easier testing as well.
Okay, great. Thank you once again. Just have some more announcements for you folks. If you are interested and you'd like to take a little deeper dive into React, we do have some courses coming up that you'll want to take note of. Introduction to React, which will be April 29th through May 1st and August 19th through the 21st. And then test-driven development using React.js and ES6, June 17th through the 21st and October 7th through the 11th. You can check those out on our website, protechtraining.com. Our next webinar is Emotional Intelligence, EQ, and Workplace Effectiveness. That's scheduled for Tuesday, April 30th from noon to 12:30. Again, blog and registration info will be on our website. And we really do want to thank you, Chris, for your insightful presentation, and to all of you for spending your time with us today. Have a great day, everybody.